Hello, everyone. This is Lisa Ruggiero. I'm a project assistant at the Environmental Finance Center at Syracuse University. On behalf of the EFCN network, I'd like to welcome you to our fifth webinar entitled Asset Management for Small Water Systems, Core Component 5, Long-Term Funding. I will be providing some technical support for today's session. Please take a moment to observe your GoToWebinar control panel. You'll see most of the functions are very self-explanatory, but I'd like to draw your attention to the questions section on your control panel. During our session today, you will all be kept on mute to ensure audio quality and minimize background noise. Should you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box at any time. We will be holding all questions until the end of today's presentation to ensure that we end on time. Today's presenter has consented to share her presentation slides with you, and we will make the slides available as well as a recording following the webinar on the EFCN website at www.efcnetwork.org. And before we get started, I'd like to do a quick sound check. Dawn, are you there?
I am here.
Dawn, you came in a little faint. Could you try it again?
Yes, is that better?
Much better, thank you. And how about Heather?
Yes, I am here.
Great, we can hear you. And so without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Heather Himmelberger. Heather is the director at the Southwest Environmental Finance Center at the University of New Mexico.
Okay, and you want to do the show my screen. There we go. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar. I hope you're all doing well and getting ready for the holidays. Today's webinar is the fifth and final webinar in our asset management series. We did a 5-part series on asset management, and this is part of our Smart Management for Small Water Systems project that was funded by the Environmental Protection Agency that has allowed the Environmental Finance Center network to work across the country with small water systems on a variety of managerial and financial topics. In this particular context, small is defined as having 10,000 people fewer in population, 10,000 people or fewer in population. Why would we want to study asset management? Well, there's a lot of reasons we want to study asset management. One of them is it allows you to individually view each of your assets. And the reason you might want to do that is because then it gives you the opportunity to look and see if you're spending excessive amounts of money on one asset or another, or if you're having trouble with one particular asset or another. So it helps you really focus in on where your problems are occurring. So rather than knowing that maybe I spent $500,000 last year on my entire system, but I don't know how I spent that money around each individual asset, you would actually know, or could actually know, I spent $100 here and $10,000 there and $3,000 there. So you can start looking at your assets individually and seeing what your expenditures are and how those assets are performing, so you can make decisions going forward about how to deal with that asset in the future. It encourages a more collaborative relationship with your customers. So a lot of times traditionally we think of the relationship with customers as more of an adversarial one, and that's not really what we want. We want a very collaborative relationship with our customers. We want our customers to understand that we are there to serve their needs, and they should be willing to pay for the service that we provide because we're providing what it is that they want. So it encourages much more of a collaborative arrangement, and instead of a more adversarial arrangement. It will provide information to aid you in communicating with both inside and outside your organization. So if you're an operator, it can help you communicate with your manager. If you're a manager, it can help you communicate either with your operator or the board. If you're a board member or other elected official, it can help you communicate with the public. So it can help you by providing the information you need to better explain to the public what it is you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it. And it also improves your response to emergency situations. When you have emergencies, it's really important to know what assets you have, where they're located, how they operate, so that you can much better respond to an emergency when it comes up, and you can keep that emergency from being a real problem situation. But overall, it really helps you decide the best way to spend your limited dollars. And again, the reason that we care about asset management is because we're in a climate of limited funds, and we have to figure out the best way to spend our limited dollars. There are 5 core components to asset management, and that's the reason we did a 5-part webinar series, so that we could cover each component in one webinar. So the first component was the current state of the assets. This component gets into what you own within your system. The next component is level of service, which gets into what you want your assets to provide. The third component is criticality, and this is where we look at which assets are more important to us in terms of overall sustained performance than others. And then we have life cycle costing, where we look at our assets, and again, we just talked about how we want to view each asset individually. Well, in the life cycle costing component, that's where you can get in there and say, well, what kind of maintenance do I want to do on each of my assets? When do I want to repair versus replace or rehabilitate my assets? And finally, funding, which will be the focus of today's webinar. What kind of money do I need? Where do I want to get the money? What does the future funding situation look like for me? So let's do a quick review, because we want each webinar to stand on its own. Even though we're focusing on a specific component, we want to make sure that any new attendees understand how we got where we got and what the other components of asset management are. So the first component, again, was current state of the assets. In this component, we ask ourselves the question of, what assets do I own? What are the physical things that are making up my system? Where are those assets located? What condition are they in? What's the remaining useful life? In other words, how much longer will that particular asset remain in service in my facility? And how much would it cost me to replace that asset in the future? And I would use the replacement cost of what I'm going to replace that asset with later on. So if I'm going to use a different type of asset, different material, something like that, I would use the replacement value of that particular asset. The reason that we really want to know about our assets and develop an inventory of what we have is it becomes very difficult to manage a system effectively when you don't know what you own. You have to know what the physical things that make up your system are in order to manage it. This is the most straightforward component. It's not the least time consuming or anything like that, but it is very straightforward. We're really just kind of inventorying up the stuff that we have and gathering the information about the items in our system. The second component is the level of service. And what we want to think about is that water utilities are first and foremost customer service businesses. You exist to provide a service to your customers. Your customers want you to be there providing that service, and that's why you're there. The reason you manage your assets is to provide that service. So it's very important to think about it as, what I'm doing is to reach, give the customers what they want. So you set some goals under this component as in terms of what you want the facility to provide, and then you measure how well you meet those goals. Again, it's difficult to manage if you don't know what you want your assets to do. So that's why we want to have goals, and we want to think about what it is we want our utility to actually do, so that will help us manage it. I always like to say this is the most underappreciated component, because people don't like to set goals. It's something that they don't feel comfortable with. They traditionally haven't done this. So it sometimes gets overlooked, and people think you can do asset management without goals, and I would argue that you can't, and that it really helps change your thinking. When you start setting goals, it will change how you view your assets and how you do the things you do. The third component is criticality. In this component, we look at what is the probability that a given asset will fail, and what's the consequence if that asset does fail. We try to think about the conditions that would cause a high-risk asset, something that is likely to fail, and a very serious consequence if it does. Those are the assets that we really need to focus our money, time, resources on, because those are the ones that are going to cause us trouble within our system. The other end is the low-risk assets. These are the assets that are not likely to fail, And if they do, they won't cause us serious consequences anyway. So these are the ones that we want to spend less of our resources and time and energy on. And again, remember, go back to the comments earlier about limited dollars. This is why we do criticality, because it will help us spread those limited dollars around our system in the most effective way. It's difficult to have the maximum impact with your limited dollars if you don't know the assets that are critical. And this is really the heart and soul of asset management. Once you understand criticality, it really helps you understand and implement the rest of asset management. Core component 4 is really looking at what are the overall costs over the entire life of your asset. So trying to move away from only considering the capital cost and instead considering the entire life cycle. What is it going to cost you to operate, maintain, rehabilitate, repair, whatever you're going to do to that asset over its life, what is that total cost? So you can compare assets on a life cycle basis rather than just a capital cost basis, so that it really can change the choices that you make. If you just compare capital costs, you may choose something that has a very high cost to operate and maintain over its life, or maybe requires significant repairs or rehabilitation later on. If you look at the overall life cycle cost, you can actually choose the asset, the type of assets is going to give you the lowest overall cost to operate. So thinking about the overall cost and comparing those is a better way to go than just comparing the capital cost of the project. And if you don't consider the life cycle costing, you're not going to get the maximum life out of your assets, and you're not going to achieve the full cost-effective operation. So this component really has the greatest potential for cost savings because it can really help you extend the life of your assets and really make the proper choices about what assets to put in your system. Today's webinar is going to focus on the 5th component, which is funding. So you've got to think about what are your funding needs? What are the things that are going to cost money in your system? So the big categories are really your day-to-day expenses. These are those things you do every day to operate, maintain, run, manage your system. And then the other big category of costs is really your capital expenditures. Those long-term expenses, the assets that you're going to have to replace, are what fall into the capital expenditure category. And then you need to ask yourself, where is the money going to come from for these different categories of cost? Well, for O&M, you have your choices pretty much of community type funds, rates, fees, penalties, impact fees, taxes, community general fund dollars. It's going to be something like that, a local input of money of some type to fund your operation and maintenance. When we get to capital projects, we have a few more options. We can have our community funds, but we can also look to outside funding. That may include state or federal grants or loans. It may include bonds. It may include bank loans. But you can get outside funding for your capital projects, whereas generally speaking, you cannot get outside funding for your operation and maintenance activities. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how that impacts your ability to fully implement asset management. Now, there are several issues that come up when we talk about funding, and I'm going to just go through some issues, some of the bigger issues that really play into the whole topic of the long-term funding. And one big issue is thinking about asset replacements in waves. Your system was not built in one continuous time span, you know, a little bit of pipe every single day. Generally speaking, systems get put in chunks. You might do a big chunk, you know, right after an economic boom. There may be a big chunk if people are moving into your area for some reason. After wars, sometimes there are spikes in the asset installation. So what happens when you have these big spikes in putting assets in is that will reflect back when you have to replace them in what sometimes people refer to as the Nessie curve, because it starts, if you see an example Nessie curve right here in this picture, you can see how it starts to have these waves. And every time it spikes up as a replacement, that means that you had put in a bunch of assets, say 50 years ago or 80 years ago or 100 years ago, and the asset life is used up at this point. So now you have a whole bunch of assets that you're going to need to be replacing. So if you look over time for a good length of time, 50 to 100 years, you start to see a Nessie pattern develop because these are all reflecting back from installations that were done before. So what you have to think about in your facility is, how was your facility put in? Did you have these waves of installation that are going to reflect back at some point in the future? And when they reflect back really depends on your particular experience with those types of assets. So if you put in pipe in, say, 1910, you know, if it lasts 100 years, you would expect a spike in 2010. Well, maybe that's not really what you saw. Maybe you found that your pipe lasts 125 years or 150 years. You can always adjust, you know, how these reflective waves occur. You know, maybe they're not 100 years. So you just adjust that and say, okay, in 150 years, now I'm going to have to replace a bunch of pipe because then it'll come due then. But the big thing is to really think about, when are these waves going to occur? You're not going to predict 50 or 100 years out the exact amount of money that you need, but at least you can be thinking about what is going to come down and hit you later on when these assets wear out and need to be renewed. And also it can help you when you have elected officials who have a tendency to want to push off costs into the future. Well, if you know you already have a bunch of expenditures coming up in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, pushing off other expenses to the future just adds to the peak, and you may end up with a much higher peak. So it can help you, you know, when you think about these reflective waves, it can help you have that discussion with your elected leaders and your customers about what is coming down and why you should not be putting off your capital expenditures, and you need to be doing them, you know, as they come up. So that's one thing to think about with funding, is really how you're going to have to put in future funding or future assets, and what kind of funding you're going to need to do that. Another issue is we really want to think about funding the full cost of our operation. We want to make sure that we're not losing money operating our systems. We really want to be generating enough money from all the revenue sources that we have, that we're covering all of our operations, all of the things that go into operating the treatment plant, the maintenance activities, whatever repairs we have to do, the spare parts we need to maintain, replacements that we need to do, debt service, and reserves. You want to have some money in a reserve account for an emergency. If you have debt outstanding, you want to have a debt reserve so that you can ensure that you'll be able to pay your bills, a repair replacement reserve, and there are other types of reserve accounts that you may want to have. And you want to have some money in there so that your facility is not operating, you know, on a month-to-month basis. You want to make sure if something happens that you're able to handle it. One issue that comes up in the full cost of operation is the idea of replacement, and how much replacement do you want to fund within this notion of a full cost of operation? Do you want to fund depreciation, meaning, you know, as those assets are being used up, you're actually building that into your rate? Do you want to replace a certain percentage of your system every year? You know, for example, if you assume that your utility will last 100 years, you should be replacing 1% of the system a year in order to have the whole thing replaced, you know, on average. So are you doing that much replacement? Is that something you want to build into your full cost of operation? You know, how do you want to do that replacement component? Because that's probably the most tricky part of what you call your full cost of operation. Most of the other items make sense as to why that's part of the full cost. The replacement is always where it gets tricky. Are you going to use grants and loans? Are you going to use your own funding? Are you going to replace it in big chunks? Are you going to replace it, you know, a percentage at a time? But the main idea is to get enough revenue so that you're covering the cost of operating your facility. Another issue that really comes up in the United States that does make it more difficult to really fully implement asset management and fully embrace the concept is this notion of whether the dollar is really a dollar when you have a capital expenditure versus an operation and maintenance expenditure. And I alluded to this a little bit earlier. So the problem that we have is we have different funding sources for capital versus O&M expenditures. So as I mentioned, for capital expenditures, sometimes there are outside funding sources that you can use. There may be a state or federal grant or loan program. There may be some bonds, things like that that can help you pay for capital expenditures. The problem is they don't pay for operation and maintenance expenditures. So sometimes when you're faced with an option of, I could replace my storage tank now using, say, federal or state grant loan combination, or I could continue to maintain it, but I have to pay for the maintenance to keep it going, you may be driven to make the capital decision when really the most economical decision overall is the operation and maintenance decision, or to continue to just do maintenance on the tank and keep it in service longer. So this is a reality that we live within, and it does impact choices that we make. And sometimes it does have an impact on really being able to fully embrace the concept of asset management, because some people will lean towards the capital expenditure because they can get funded for that, whereas they can't get funded for the operation and maintenance part. It's something that doesn't exist so much in other countries that are doing asset management, because they have different ways of funding and different ways of looking at that question of, are your dollars different when they're capital versus operation and maintenance? So it's a reality that we just have to be aware of. There isn't a whole lot we can do about it at this point, other than really thinking about what we're doing, and are we making choices that are really in the best interest of our system overall and the best economic interest. Another issue with funding is willingness to charge. You hear a lot of talk about willingness to pay, and there is an issue with that, but there's also an issue of willingness to charge. When we have elected leaders who have to agree to raise a rate, they have to be willing to do that, and many of them are not. They're very uncomfortable with raising rates or telling their customers that that's what they're going to do. Sometimes people run on platforms saying that they will not raise the water rates. A lot of times they want to push it down the road. So sometimes we don't even get to find out if a customer is willing to pay or not, because our elected officials aren't willing to charge. So we really have to start affecting this dynamic and try to provide the proper tools, through asset management and other means, to give them the information they need and the confidence to go ahead and charge the rates, and being willing to charge what it costs to actually, have the service. We're going to have a video on this topic from the Louisville Water Company, Jim Smith. So Don, if you would, run the audio for this video.
I think if you ask customers would they want another 20 cents on their bill a month to fund an infrastructure reserve, sure. Now at what point does that get to the point where we say, no, I don't want to do that anymore? But yeah, I think there's a lot more rate capacity out there if you bring your case to your stakeholders, which includes your customers and public, on what you're doing, and then follow it up with doing it and doing it well.
And I think what Jim is talking about there is the very issue that we were talking about, that if the leaders are willing to talk to the customers about, are you willing to pay a little bit more to improve our infrastructure or improve the water system, that there may be a lot more willingness to pay than sometimes the elected officials are aware of. Sometimes they perceive a very low willingness to pay, and maybe it's not as low as what they think. So again, we need to start addressing the issue of, how do you get them more comfortable with the idea of going forward with a rate increase if that's what's necessary to have a good, sound operation. So one of the ways that you can build rate capacity is really to have some community involvement. Give the community a chance to see what the water system is about. Louisville, for example, opened up their water utility to public tours so that people could see how the water is produced. They could see what the water, how it's made, and they had a very overwhelming response to their tours. Other groups have done things like environmental fairs or water fairs or sustainability fairs, again, to give people the opportunity to talk to their water officials. Sometimes they do water fairs where there's water testing done. So anything that you can do to bring your community into the idea of what the water system is about, what kind of service they're providing, what it takes to run a system. Sometimes customers don't really know how involved a water system actually is. You know, all the components that go into it, you know, how the water is treated, how it's pumped out of the ground, or how it was put into storage tanks, and all the valves and hydrants and so forth that are in your system. So if you can do a little bit more to get the community involved, it can help you, again, to build that rate capacity and try to get the public on board for rate increases that are necessary. And we have another video from Louisville Water Company, and you can see the buildings in this screenshot shows the buildings that Jim Smith will be talking about as he's talking about the historic structures that the Louisville Water Company owns. These are a couple of their very historic old structures that were some of the original equipment, original buildings when they built the Louisville Water Company. So Dawn, if you would play this video.
We're doing about a $1.2 million renovation. Unfortunately, these historic structures are money pits, but they're well worth it for the community and well worth it for us in building rate capacity among our communities, do the kind of things that we need to do, like replace buried infrastructure and that type of stuff. So I think that's the other key point, is if you manage your assets related to, to the fact that they're truly community assets, sometimes you can build rate capacity there, just because of the branding of your company. And obviously, when they built these old structures, they weren't looking at just building something utilitarian. They were looking at creating a brand for the water utility. This is the Louisville Water Company, and it still is today. This is our symbol. So that also builds rate capacity. And that rate capacity allows you to take additional funding and put into to help perhaps developing infrastructure renewal programs, asset management programs, robust preventative maintenance programs, which further enhance the sustainability of your assets.
Okay. And what Jim is talking about is kind of what the next portion that we want to talk about is when we get into funding, it's a very complicated picture because we have to have that conversation with our customers. We have to get our customers willing to support the rate that we need to charge. We have to get our elected officials willing to charge the rate, and we have to have managers and operators who can develop the information to tell a good story about why you need the money, what the money is going to be for. We want to build in confidence. So as people are going forward and saying, we need $5 more a month or $10 more a month or $2 more a month, that we're very confident that we do actually need the money. And we know what the money is for. And we also want to frame the message. It's very important for us to think about the fact that we are in the customer service business. So the message should not be one of how much does the water cost. The message should be one of what is the service we provide. And if you think about other utilities, such as the electric company or your cable company or your phone service, all of those types of businesses always present you with the customer service that they're giving you first before they ever get into the money part. They want you to understand what it is you're getting for the money that you're going to pay. So if it's something like a cell phone service, they're going to tell you you get so many minutes, or you get so many data plans, or you get certain kind of phone, whatever it is, and they will focus very heavily on the service that they're providing and much less on the money part. And by the time they get through telling you the service, if that matches the service that you want, you're willing to pay for it because you realize this is a service I want, this is what they're going to give me, and this is what I have to pay. In the water industry, we need to start maybe thinking about that a little bit more. How can we frame our message that talks about the service that we provide? The water that's of good quality, it's healthy, it's at good pressure, you're able to do so many things with it, it's actually very inexpensive. So how do we frame that message and talk about what it is we're providing our customers so that they're much more willing to pay the rates that we need to charge in order to just run our, day-to-day operations? How can you build some of this community support? One of the things is to really focus in on what is the money going to be used for. what is it you need to do? Do you need to replace infrastructure? Do you need to hire an operator? Do you need to train an operator? Do you need to retain an operator? What is it that you need to use the money for? Are you having to put in more electrical control, something like that? But I think being very specific about, we need this money because we're going to do X, Y, Z. And then also talking about the risk, which was the focus of our third webinar. What would be the risk if we didn't spend the money? What are the kinds of things that would happen? What's the benefit if we do spend the money? So, for example, if we have a town that maybe had a lot of newly repaved streets and we're having a lot of water line breaks, if we don't have the money to replace the water lines before they repave the streets, and then we're digging up the streets constantly, that's something that customers don't like very much. So if it's explained to them, if we spend, say, $1 million on pipe replacement, we can avoid most of that digging up of the streets later, will the customers support you in that? And that's something that you could have that conversation with your customers and elected officials and say, hey, if we spend this much money, which would be a rate increase of, whatever, $2, $3 a month, would customers be willing to spend that in order to have the piping replaced under the streets that we're repaving? So I think the more that we can get our message very clear and explain what the money's for, why we need to do these projects, the better off we're going to be moving forward and trying to get community support for the rates that we're going to charge. We have a video here from Old Forge, New York, and Ted will be talking about the fact that they implemented an asset management program and were able to increase the rates to what they needed to be to fund their infrastructure, and they really didn't have a problem with the rate increase that they did. So Don, if you would start the video, please.
When the budget came up and there were public hearings on the budget, and double-digit rate increases were talked about when the asset management plan was discussed, and the fact that we had established the reserves, there was no public dissent. There was no. The only comment that I heard at the public hearing is, why don't you do this with other departments in the town? So, that made us feel good about what we did here in the sewer district.
So again, if you think about what they were doing, they were trying to explain to the public what the money was going to be used for, how they used it. It was part of their overall asset management plan that they could present, told a very clear story, and they didn't have trouble with the rate increases because the public understood what they were trying to do and where they were trying to go. I've had the opportunity to watch some public meetings in other communities in other countries where they've done asset management very well and presented things very clearly to the public. And the public was actually very, very supportive of what the utility was trying to do, and in some cases actually argued for a higher rate increase than what the community itself was asking for, because they may have wanted some projects to be done a little sooner, and they would say, well, hey, if we accept maybe a 10% rate increase instead of an 8% rate increase, could we have you put in the new pipe or tank or pump or whatever it was a little sooner? So the more you can get that public support and the understanding of what money is for and how it impacts customer service, the more support you can get from your customers and the more ability you have to raise the rates and get people willing to pay those rates to get the service that they want. We wanted to go into a couple of poll questions. One of the things that we wanted to make sure everybody on the webinars is knowledgeable of is that the Environmental Finance Center Network does have some assistance available, some technical assistance. And we wanted to open up a poll question to see if anybody was interested in this type of assistance. So Lisa, if you would start our poll questions. I think we have 2 of them today. So the first question is, would you be interested in assistance in any of the following asset management areas? So if you have an interest in asset inventory or mapping, developing your goals under the level of service, reviewing risk analysis or criteria for related to risk analysis, criticality, you could check that box. Life cycle costing, and this is where the fourth component, the webinar we talked about last time. What kind of O&M activities will you do? What's the split between O&M and capital? And then finally the funding, such as reviewing your rate structure. We're not going to talk a lot about rate structures today because that's the subject of a whole nother webinar course that you are welcome to watch later on. But if you have an interest in having somebody work with you on your rate structure, that's something that you could select here. So go ahead if you haven't already done so and just take a moment to click in if any of those following areas would be useful to you for one-on-one assistance. Okay, it looks like we have quite a few that would like assistance in life cycle costing. And we will take the information that you've now provided us and we'll follow up with you. I would like to point out that we will not be following up before the holidays. It's a little bit too close to the end of the year at this point, so the follow-up will occur in January. So sometime in January you'll be contacted to follow up a little bit more about what we might be able to do to help you in these areas that you've just indicated. And then we have one more poll question. And this question is more related to other areas that you might be interested in assistance. So we've talked over the last 5 webinars about asset management, but we also have other topics such as water loss reduction, water system collaboration, and that entails any type of working together from one system to another. Fiscal planning and rate setting, and this is where we get in much heavier into the actual rate setting, how that's done, what types of rate structures there are, and that type of thing. And then energy management and funding coordination. So if you have an interest in one of these other topics that aren't the subject of this webinar, please go ahead and click in on whichever topic is something that you think technical assistance would help you, and go ahead and click in and submit. And it looks like on my screen some of the question is cut off, so it's supposed to say if you are interested in receiving technical assistance in any of these areas, please select one. So again, it should say if you are interested in receiving technical assistance in any of these areas, please select. Okay, it looks like we have a pretty good mix. A lot of people interested in fiscal planning and rate setting, which is a really good companion piece to the webinar that we're doing today, because you will naturally lead into rate setting because that's where a lot of your revenue is going to come from. So once you get a handle on what kind of funding you need and how that looks over the next 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, then you naturally get into rate setting and what does my rate structure look like, and is it adequate? Does it need to be adjusted? Does it meet the goals that I have? Because there are actually goals involved in setting rate structures. And what are you trying to achieve with a rate structure? And all of that would come up in the fiscal planning and rate setting topic area. So it makes a lot of sense that that was a popular topic for assistance. All right, if we could go back to the presentation. Okay. So we've come to the portion of our webinar where we talk a bit about what you can do at your own facilities. So one of the things we've talked about at each of these webinars is look around your facility and see who could help you with these kinds of activities. And the more broad you are, including all different types of people at your facility, the better off you will be. And in particular, today's webinar, we talked about funding. If you're going to tackle this part of asset management, you really want to have the people in your facility that are involved in the finances on your team. You want to know what's happening with rate structures and revenue and all that type of thing. So you definitely want to have your financial people on your team. We also have had this particular item on each time is complete the interactive asset management IQ tool. You can go to our website and you can complete this asset management IQ online. It's a series of 30 questions that's meant to be relatively easy to complete that will give you a baseline as to where your asset management practice is today, so that if you improve in one area or another, you can monitor that progress. So it's a way to give you a baseline and then have you look at, later on, maybe a year down the road or 6 months down the road or 2 years down the road, you can go back to your original scores and say, I've improved in several different areas, or my score went up from 50 to 75, so I can see that I'm doing better in my asset management practice. And I strongly encourage you to be as brutally honest with yourself as possible. I mean, this is for you. It's a tool for yourselves. So be honest about the answers and see where you are, in a really serious look at your facility and how you do things. Figure out that benchmark of where you are. And this particular tool allows you to either print out a paper copy and you can fill it out that way, or you can take it online and then you can download it to a PDF that you could print. So either way, you can have a record of what you've done and go back and look at that later. Now, looking more at what you can do with activities related to today's webinar, one of the things you might want to think about is, when was the last time you reviewed your rates? Were they rates that you set 20 years ago and you've never looked at them again? Do you review them annually? Find out, when was the last time we actually sat down and reviewed our rates? And if it's been a very long time, it might be a good time for you to go back and review them. Generally, we like to recommend that you at least review your rates annually. Sort of another matter of whether you raise them annually or not, but at least look at them every year and say, does it make sense? Do they cover the costs? How short do we come every year? Or do we have enough money to meet our costs and to have reserve accounts? So look at your rates, find out when they were last reviewed, and if they haven't been reviewed for a while, it might be a good time to suggest to look at those rates and really see how much revenue they're providing and how well that matches up with your needs. Now the next part is, when was the last time you raised your rates? And again, this is a different question than when you reviewed them. You may review them every year, but they may not be raised every year. So think about, when was the last time that you actually had a rate increase? Was it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 1 year ago, 2 years ago? When were those rates raised? Think about all the costs that have gone up. If it's been, say, 5 or 10 years since you raised your rates, think about all the costs that have risen. The cost of gasoline, the cost of equipment, the cost of materials, and how do you keep up with costs of inflation and the cost of things going up if you haven't raised your rates? So really dig into, when was the last time you did it, and is this something that you're going to need to think about doing in the future? Are you going to have to raise your rates if they haven't been raised for 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Another one, determine if your current budget covers the full cost of your operation. So you have, if you have a budget now, do you feel like that covers all the cost of your operation? And if you remember, what we were talking about was, all of our operation costs, the energy, the salaries, any chemicals that we have to buy. It should cover the maintenance activities that you have to do. It should cover your repairs, your debt service, and then reserves. And then again, we talked about how there's not a hard and fast rule of how much replacement it has to cover, but at least it should cover the other costs. So you can look at your budget and say, do we actually do that? Do we actually cover the full cost of our operation? And if not, what are the gaps? What are the portions of your operation that aren't fully covered? Where are those holes that you need to look at in the future to try to get additional revenue? Then you want to think about, well, when are your waves of asset replacement likely to hit? So we talked about the Nessie curve, and if you put in a bunch of pipes, say at the turn of the century, when you hit the next century, you're going to be looking at some pipe that probably is no longer functional, and you'll have a wave of replacements that will come up for maybe the next 10 years or so. So think about, well, when do you expect those waves of replacement? You know, what does your operation look like? So do you expect waves to be 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now? You know, what do you look like in terms of having replacements coming up? Because they're usually big ticket items, and you really need to be planning ahead as to how you're going to deal with that situation when it arises. And then think about if you had to raise rates because you didn't have enough money to cover your costs, think about how you would build community support for that. What kind of message would you tell them? What do you think would be important pieces of information for them to know? Are there ways you could get the community involved? Could they have tours? Could they could you have public sessions such as fairs or sustainability events or something like that? Is there a way to get some community support for what you're trying to do? Think about what would work in your community, because it's going to be very different from place to place. What works in one place may not work in another. So what would work for your community? What could you do to build support for additional rate increases if that was necessary? We definitely want to thank EPA for providing the funding for this project. We appreciated the fact that we were able to deliver this 5-part webinar series, and we appreciate EPA for having funded this project and allowing us to broadcast. And I will put our contact information. As always, you can contact myself or Don Null with questions after the webinar. And this brings us to the end of the prepared portion of the webinar, and we'll check to see if there's any questions that have come up during the webinar. And if there's anything that you are thinking of, now would be a very good time for you to write your question into the chat box, and we'll be happy to take as many questions as we can in the time remaining. So Dawn, do we have any questions?
First, I just wanted to let everyone know that we will also be sending out an evaluation after the webinar is concluded. So we would like to get your feedback on how the webinar went today and ways that we can improve upon the webinar, those kinds of things. So you look for an email from us, and if you don't mind taking just a few minutes to fill out the evaluation, it'd be really helpful for us.
And also, one other thing that I'll mention is we have discussed the possibility of repeating the webinar series in January or February. And doing the 5-part series again, because we know that there were some people that had trouble with the dates that were chosen because we were close to a couple different holidays. We were close to Thanksgiving and we were close to Christmas with this last one. So we're looking into that. So keep your eyes open. We will let you know if we're going to have another webinar series. They're always going to be posted as well on our efcnetwork.org website, so you can always look there. And if we do have another webinar series, you're welcome to invite others that you know, let them know that the webinar series is going on, because we'd like to be able to, serve as many people as possible.
Okay, so I see that we had Lynn raise your hand, and we can't unmute you at this point. So if you can type your question, if you have a question for us, into the box that says question, then we'll be able to see what your question is and hopefully answer it. The other questions that we've had come in, do you have plans for future webinar series? What topics?
Oh, and I mentioned how we may have another asset management series, but we're also going to be doing a series on water loss that's coming up. It'll be a 3-part webinar series. It'll be a very similar format where we'll do 3 one-hour sessions, a couple weeks apart, and we'll talk about issues related to strategic water loss reduction and what types of things you can build into a program. There's going to be some webinars on water system collaboration. I think there'll be some additional webinars on rates and finance. So please check with the environmental efcnetwork.org website, because all the webinars will be posted there, and there are some webinars that are upcoming. So keep your eye on those because there will be more between now and April.
All right, a question from Janice. She says, my board thinks we can find grant money that is not attached to loan money for remote read meters. They want to hire someone to find these grants. What do you think?
I think it's highly unlikely. There was a time under the ARRA funding, the Resource and Recovery Act, I forget whether A was America or whatever, but it was the Resource and Recovery Act, and there were some grant funds made available under the Title Green funding, and there was pretty high restrictions on how to spend the money and how fast you had to spend the money. So it's kind of an unusual circumstance because the states had money that they had to spend relatively quickly, and it had to be spent on what they called shovel-ready projects. So it had to be people who were ready to go very quickly. Traditional green projects, you know, or more involved green projects like solar panels or alternative fuels or biofuels or something like that are generally a little bit more involved, and they were taking a long time to get going. So there was at one time some money that was spent on remote read meters because they kind of put them under that green category. Most of that funding, I believe, is not there anymore, and I think you're probably going to find that most of that funding would be in a loan category or a grant loan combination. I think you would struggle to find a pure grant to do that kind of thing. I won't say it's impossible, but I think it's a lot less likely, particularly a lot less likely than it was before. So unless there's another round of ARRA funding or some push to really get remote read meters or something like that, I think it's unlikely that you'll actually find grant funds for something like that.
The one area that you might want to check with is your state energy office. A lot of the state's energy offices are becoming more and more aware of how much energy water and wastewater systems use. And so some of that funding that was available is still floating around in some of the energy offices. So you might check there, but as far as finding those kinds of grants, that's the one recommendation that I would have, is checking with your state's energy office and asking those questions. Okay, a question from Lynn. What other types of funding are available for long-term water replacement projects in addition to raising water rates?
As we talked about before, the long-term funding opens up possibilities of state and federal funding, so that's where the state revolving loan fund programs come into play. EPA set up programs in all, or worked with the states to set up programs in all 50 states to have a revolving loan fund. And each state is a little bit different in terms of how you get prioritized to be on the list and who gets funded. But in general, that's funding that's available for people who have issues with infrastructure related to public health. Like maybe you're not meeting a standard, or you're going to have difficulty meeting a standard. You're having some problems at your utility. And then you can go to the State Revolving Loan Fund program and apply for funding there. And it's usually very favorable terms, you know, very low interest rate spread over about 20 years usually, sometimes 30 years if you're a disadvantaged community. If a state has a disadvantaged community program, sometimes there's lower interest rates or maybe even negative interest rates, which effectively reduce the principal you have to pay back. So there's that fund. There's also a lot of USDA programs under the Rural Development Office. So there are many programs under that that fund water and wastewater. There's the Community Development Block Grant Program that, generally speaking, those are grant funds, but they're usually smaller dollar projects. It's not usually a really large project that's going to be funded because the funds are competitive and there's not as much there. So that's another source of funding. In some states, there's other sources as well. The state itself may have some funding sources. So there are a lot of different places you can go to get water funding. And actually on the efcnetwork.org website, if you go under resources, you can find a listing of the state and federal funding sources in just about every state. There's a list of the various programs there. And you can look and see what programs are in your state and who the contact people are. So it's a very good resource, to look and see if your state is there. If your state is missing, contact us and we can work with you on that. But I think we pretty much have all the states up there now. And again, you can go on there, you can look at the list of what funding sources are available in your state, because there's usually the big three sources, state revolving fund, the Rural Development Program, and CDBG, but then there's always a couple of more that vary a little bit from state to state. So, please have a look at the website and look at the list of programs in your state.
And that concludes the questions that have come in so far.
Okay, we're just about towards the end. So if you have questions that come up, please send them to us later. You can use our contact information there and send us those questions. And again, I will just make reference one last time to the efcnetwork.org. So efcnetwork, all one word, .org. If you go to that website, there's a lot of resources and information. That's where you can look to see what the upcoming webinar events are. You could look to see if there's any in-person training coming into your area. You can look and see what resources are there, especially like the funding resources that I just mentioned, where it would list all the state and federal funding for water and wastewater in your state. So it's a really good place to keep track of. You maybe bookmark it on your site and go back and look at that information, and it's there to help you as you move through your asset management journey. And unless any questions have come in, I think we're about at the end of our webinar. We're just about out of time anyway. So Dawn, has anything else come in, or are we good?
That is all.
Okay, well, I thank you. For anybody who participated in all 5, I thank you. Anybody who participated in 1 or more, I thank you as well for being with us on this webinar series. I wish you a very happy holidays, and keep your eye out, because we may end up repeating the series in January and February.